We'll just give everybody a little bit more time to roll in before we get started. Just about like a minute or two. Does that sound good?
Sure.
Victoria, I'll let you take it away whenever you're ready, whenever you feel like we should start.
Okay, great.
And I'm going to self-mute and then unmute when it's time.
Sounds good.
All right, I think we can get started. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this Thursday for our webinar. This will be a recorded event, so if you can't stay for the entire time, we will have a recording available following at the end that will be available on the Office of Spiritual Life Facebook. My name is Victoria, and I'm one of the moderators for today's crash course on civic engagement. We encourage you all to use gallery view to properly see our panelists as they speak and present. Kyle will be our other moderator for this discussion.
Hello, I'm Kyle. We put a lot of time in today's event. We have a lot of amazing experts coming to speak today, and we hope you're going to have some great takeaways. We'll be discussing the importance of civic participation and how you can be more engaged in our democracy, and hopefully, you know, even during the pandemic, you'll find some ways to get involved. So before we let the experts take the floor, let's share a little background behind the organization of this event. Oop, that slide isn't in there anymore. Okay. So you want to do the next part, Victoria?
Sure, yeah. This crash course is sponsored by the Offices of Spiritual Life and Community Service at the College of St. Rose. As current students, Kyle and I became members of the Democratic Justice Group. We were in charge of organizing a day of events which focused on civic engagement for the school's annual Heritage and Social Justice Week. But due to the coronavirus outbreak, campuses were shut down and our efforts had to be moved online. Two of our other members have contributed behind the scenes to make this event happen, but as they're essential workers, they could not join us today. You may have heard us mention civic engagement a couple of times, so we'd like to provide you with a definition of what that is. Civic engagement is working to make a difference in the civic life of our communities by developing knowledge, skills, values, motivation, collecting those resources, and trying to promote the quality of life in our community, both politically and non-politically.
This panel discussion is our way of tackling issues surrounding democratic justice in hopes of creating greater levels of civic participation. The topics of discussion brought to you by our panelists here are fake news, youth voter importance, voting, the pandemic impacts, and how you can make a difference. Our goal today is that whatever your role is in your community, you will leave this webinar with something, a new idea, a fresh perspective, a new strategy that you can apply to be more civically engaged.
We'll take a few moments before each topic to introduce the panelists. Each panelist will then have around 15 to 20 minutes of uninterrupted sharing of their expertise on one of their topics. Our panelists will be screen sharing slides, so if you do have any questions during this time, please leave them in the chat box. And be specific, and we can direct those questions to the panelists following their presentations. We will have about 5 to 10 minutes of Q&A at the end, in which Kyle or myself will direct those questions for you. And then we'll conclude with a summary and a thank you. So does anyone have any questions before we begin? Right.
All right, I will stop screen sharing and let you take over, Youngin. Oh, you're muted.
Let's see.
Hello, try that again. My name is Youngin Kim, and I'm a librarian with the Neil Hellman Library. Thank you all for the invite. Today, I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking not so much about fake news, but just information and misinformation, which fake news falls under that information or that umbrella of misinformation. But I think right now, we can sort of approach this topic a little more broadly than just fake news. And so I'm just gonna hop into my slides here and get us going. Let's see. Okay, so hopefully you're seeing my screen here, right?
Yep.
Yeah, so I wanted to talk about information, or more specifically misinformation, during this time of the COVID-19 pandemic. I think we've experienced, you know, personally, just the sheer amount of information that we're all being bombarded with, and that information, I'm sure we've all experienced, is both good and bad. And it's really the bad side that I want to talk about, and perhaps provide some strategies for how we can be more responsible with how we consume information, and especially how we share information. I think the information we each choose to consume, and certainly what we choose to incorporate into our scholarship, and what we choose to share in our daily lives, those are all political decisions. And if we want to be truly engaged and responsible citizens, then part of our responsibility is to be mindful of the type of information that we are sharing, because we've witnessed that there are real world consequences when false information is disseminated and just put out there. So as a librarian, my job involves connecting library users with all sorts of information. But I think more importantly, that act of connecting students with information involves teaching students how to approach information with a critical eye. And oftentimes when I start this process, I start by making a very basic distinction between scholarly and non-scholarly sources. So you can sort of see on the screen here what some of those basic differences are. And I think in academia, we all know that generally speaking, scholarly sources of information can be pretty trusted. It's research, it's produced by experts in a particular field, and it often goes through a very rigorous peer-reviewed process. Non-scholarly information, on the other hand, it can be murkier territory to navigate for all of the reasons that are listed there. It can be authored by anyone, it's intended for a general audience, it can be commercial in nature, or sponsored by a special interest group, and it but the flip side of that is that non-scholarly information is not bad information, not all of it, right? But not all of it's created equal. And so it really behooves us to, anytime we approach non-scholarly information, really think critically about what we're reading, what we're absorbing, and certainly what we're sharing. So we're actually in this really bizarre time now, right? Because again, we're being bombarded by information. And of course, someone had to come up with a new word to describe this situation that we're in. And so a word that I've noticed sort of being passed around online is infodemic. And an infodemic is defined as a surfeit or surplus of information about a problem that is viewed as being a detriment to its solution. So I think a lot of us have sort of observed this happening. People passing around information, oftentimes with good intentions, but ultimately it leading to problems because I think mentally we get to a point where we're absorbing so much that we're actually not really absorbing. And I think for a lot of us, or for a lot of consumers, that line between like fact and fiction true information and false information, it starts to get blurred. And again, this can have real world consequences, not only in our lives as individuals, but certainly when we share bad information, it affects, it has the ability to affect, have a further reach than just ourselves. So I think now more than ever, we need to rely on facts and science. And I think this is something we can all agree on. So I'm guessing that this man's face has become a daily fixture in many of our lives. If you don't know who this is New York's Governor Andrew Cuomo. And you can see him, I feel like he's on the news all the time. He's on the news and he's sharing information about the state of the health crisis in the state of New York. And I think whether or not you like him, most of us can agree that the information he shares is, for the most part, useful. It's based on data, and it's based on analysis that is gathered and provided by places like the New York Health Department, medical experts, epidemiologists, policy and security experts, and other reliable sources. The flip side of that would be misinformation or incomplete information, carelessly communicated information. It comes to us in as I said, lots of different shapes and forms, and it can happen on large platforms such as major news networks during, I don't know, news conferences held by influential political leaders in the country. But it also happens on a smaller scale as well, right? On Twitter, depending on what your audience is like, the size of your audience, it happens on Facebook. And again, it can have large consequences, it can have small consequences. And I'm really not gonna get too much into the politics of the two examples that are on the screen right now, but certainly I would think that it's difficult to argue that this was not carelessly communicated information, if not false information altogether. So that is something to keep in mind. So an example of a smaller scale misinformation on a smaller scale might be something like the thing that you see right now, which I grabbed from Facebook. Someone that I know shared this. And while it might seem innocuous and the person certainly had good intentions when they shared it, it's not true. And I think when we put stuff like this out into the world, it has, you know, it can impact people's lives. You know, someone might see this, it might give them a false sense of hope. They might waste a bunch of time trying to actually do this to get free formula. And again, it's bad information, and we should think more critically about sharing that stuff before we do that. So how do you spot fake news? How do you spot misinformation? This is a little graphic that was put out by the International Federation of Library Associations and Institutions. It's just a basic little sort of guideline that we can use when searching for sources for academic writing, but also just in our daily lives, right? So really quickly, I will run through. Consider your source. So think about who's sharing the news or where it's published, right? Read beyond headlines. Right now, I think media in general, regardless of, in an ideal world, news is unbiased and it's simply fact reporting. But I think that many news outlets, they do have a political bend, whether it be conservative or more liberal. And I think many of the news outlets are guilty of clickbait headlines, both sides of the aisle. So that is something that we need to think about, and we need to learn to read beyond just the headline to actually click on the news articles and really examine the content closely. I can't tell you how many times I have seen comments on newspaper articles shared via social media where it's clear the people have not actually read the article itself, and that they're relying solely on what's in the headline. And the headlines, they are intentionally not intentionally, I don't know. I can't speak to the intentions of the writers, but I think sometimes they are written as clickbait just to try to draw more readership. But people have short attention spans, and sometimes they don't go beyond a headline or a byline. We should be thinking about who the authors are. Again, just because you don't have a PhD does not necessarily mean that the information you put out there can't be good, that it can't be reliable, but we should think about who's writing it, whether or not people are supporting their sources. Again, we live in such a weird time where even the CDC, when it came to that piece about hydrochloroquine, a month and a half ago, they were putting out advisements to the public saying that, yeah, you can consider using this as a potential treatment, only to have them retract that a month and a half later. So when we talk about experts, it's really murky territory right now, because one would hope that we could rely on an institution like the CDC, but these are strange times. And when institutions like that are becoming politicized, then there are times where you have to pause and really do the due diligence to try to find out if you can corroborate some of the information that is being shared by some of these sources. Dates are important. Again, that's sort of another example with the hydrochloroquine. A month and a half ago, CDC was like, yay. And then now they're saying, oh, it's not great. There's evidence that shows that people have actually have had worse outcomes when they're treated with that particular drug. So look at the dates of when things were published. And then, is it a joke? There's always satire. There was that, I don't know how many of you saw that Onion headline where about a month ago they had a headline that said, it was something to the effect of like, man chooses to buy all the cleaners in grocery store just in case, the government recommends them as potential cures. And the timing of that's pretty funny, because that was a month before Trump made the statement about using disinfectants in human bodies, right? And again, we can argue if he intended for that to be legit information, if he was being sarcastic as he claimed or not. The fact of the matter is that he communicated this information, and people that are out there, they may not necessarily think about something like that critically, and there are real world consequences, right? There was a man in Arizona who died because he took a derivative or a related chemical related to hydrochloroquine when that news first started coming out from the Trump administration that it was a potential cure. So a person lost his life. Another thing that we should think about is checking your biases. And this goes for everyone, regardless of what political side of the spectrum you're on. When you see news, think about what the intentions are of the person sharing it. Are they trying to sway your political voting, the way you're going to vote in the next election cycle? Is there some sort of ulterior motive for why they might be sharing that information? And again, being critical about whether or not that information is true. So we always tell students in the library that when in doubt, ask an expert, whether that be a librarian, certainly a professor. And I find also that fact-checking websites like Snopes and PolitiFact are useful, because there are people out there that are vetting the information that is being shared. So what does this all mean in terms of civic engagement? My general rule of thumb when sharing information is to do no harm. I think that's something that we should all just think about. Do no harm. Is the piece of information that I'm going to share out there potentially cause someone to do something that may either harm themselves or harm others? And harm can be defined broadly as, whether it be physical, mental, economic harm, right? So also we need to approach information with a critical eye. Question everything. I think that should just be a rule of thumb for everything in life. As college students, our faculty want you to all think critically, right? And that means questioning everything, being willing to challenge false information, be brave and be willing to do that. Think twice about before sharing information. So, running through that process of spotting fake news, I think it's worth taking a little bit of extra time before putting things out into the world, and gently refute information when you encounter it. You can do it gently, you can do it roughly. I say gently just because you can, what's the saying? You can catch more flies with honey than vinegar. If you go in hard, then you may, in fact, shut that person on the receiving end off, and they just will not be willing to listen to you. They may not be willing to listen one way or another, but at least if you gently refute with facts, it doesn't really give them a leg to stand on. Yeah, so that is all I have to share today. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Youngin, for that. Tackling the information problem that we're dealing with, especially now. So we're just gonna jump right into the next presenter. Dr. Strauss, if you would like to take it from here.
Wait, hang on. Okay, I got unmuted, thank you. I was looking for the button. It always takes me a minute to find it. And now I will share my screen with you. And just give me a moment to get that into presentation mode. There we go. It wouldn't let me do it. Sorry. Okay, so you can't see it, right? Let me go back and fix it. And I even tested it earlier and it worked. Okay, let me try again. Okay, do you see that now? Okay, so I will try to make it larger. There we go, from beginning. There we go. Okay, now it should work. So I wanted to talk to you today, particularly for the students in the group and for anybody else kind of in that younger demographic. And by younger, I'm referring to like roughly 18 to 40. And I want to start with just an acknowledgement that the younger generations have been hearing for a very long time that they do not participate, they don't vote enough, they don't take advantage of their power. Politicians will never listen to them because of that. And that negativity tends to feed on itself, and then people say, oh, well, we don't vote anyway, and it becomes almost a self-fulfilling prophecy. I want to tell you that that information is changing dramatically. It used to be true that the young didn't vote. That is no longer the case. I want to start by talking about why the younger generation is becoming more involved, and then I'll provide you with some data showing how much they are. The current college generation, which has been nicknamed Generation Z, is feeling incredible levels of stress that are not being felt at the same rate by other adult populations. The data here are from a publication in October 2018. There's a citation down there at the bottom for you. But you'll note that as of that date, a full 75% of that generation felt stress by the idea of mass shooting. This is not normal. It is not normal that people in their late teens and early 20s should be feeling anxiety over something like that. Now, that number is also high among the broader adult population, shown in the black bar at 62%. But that 75%, I think, is incredibly striking and should really present a level of concern for many of us. Well over half, 62% are concerned about a rise in suicide, 58% are worried about climate change and global warming, 57% about separation and deportation of immigrant and migrant families, and 53% are worried or anxious about widespread sexual harassment and assault. Now, the broader adult population is concerned about these issues as well, again shown by the black bars on that graph. But we're looking at a current generation that is feeling particularly motivated by these issues. These issues, in addition to the ones that were shown before, the young voters who are becoming very activist right now are really particularly passionate about climate change and global warming. You can see here our young international leader focused on the screen, gun control, and Black Lives Matter and other racial justice issues. These are kind of the nexus of political issues that are motivating the younger generation today. And when I say motivating, I mean they are really changing their approach. These data go through the 2018 midterm election. They're from Pew. You can find them online if you want to, published just about a year ago in May 2019. And if you look at the graph on the left, you will note that younger generations, and we're talking here about Gen Z, millennials, and Gen X, so roughly my age and younger, outvoted older populations. These are the baby boomers and those who are older than that generation for the first time ever in 2018. And you can see that really sharp increase. I don't know if you can see the little arrow on my screen here, but down around 40% or lower in 2014. That was the previous midterm election before the most recent one we had. And then a very sharp jump from 2014 to 2018. That is this younger population showing up at a much, much greater rate. That population, that voter turnout rate, is largely viewed as a reaction to the current Trump administration. He and his policies have a lot of younger people very angry about the current direction of this country, and they're making their votes known in order to counter that. The doubling of their vote is shown in more detail in that graph on the right. And again, we're looking at a doubling of millennial turnout from the 2014 election to 2018. So again, a midterm election is a federal election. Members of Congress are up for election, but the president is not. So it's an even-yeared election year, even-numbered election year, but not with a presidential election. And if you take a look at that, you'll note that what we term the greatest generation went through kind of a general decline, and then we stopped counting them not too long ago because that generation is elderly and is being replaced by younger voters. The silent and boomer generations definitely continue to go up. Baby boomers in particular, 64% of them turned out to vote in 2018. This is a startlingly high number for a midterm election. But then if you look at the other ones, Gen X at 55%, all voters averaging at 53%, and then go down to the other two. Millennial voters, these are roughly now in their late 20s to 30s, 42% of them turned out to vote in a midterm election. Generally, a midterm election turnout is going to average 40% nationwide, and this one group of younger voters managed to turn out at a higher rate than that. And Generation Z, current college students, we have only one dot for them because they weren't old enough yet to vote before 2018. And they are starting at 30% turnout. Now, again, 30% isn't quite high enough yet. I think many people want to see that number going up, but they're starting higher than either millennials or Gen X did, both of which started at only a 23% turnout rate. So if we think about the possibility of the youth vote, what we know is that the vote roughly doubled from 2014 to 2018. They preferred Democratic candidates by a wide margin. College students voted at an even higher rate than that younger generation as a whole, reaching 40.3% turnout. This is why Democrats won in 2008. So if you're happy with the blue wave that happened with the House in 2018, you can thank younger voters. If you're not happy with it, you can be angry at young voters. But without that turnout, that would not have occurred. So this, in my view, is really showing why I argued in the beginning that young voters are really beginning to change their voting habits. Coming up in November 2020, there will be more voters, possibly, if they turn out, there will be more possible voters ages 18 to 40 than any other age group. And so we did see that in 2018, younger voters outvoted baby boomers and older. We can continue that number. That trend and that trajectory can continue to go up. Because younger people frequently, until now, voted younger at lower rates, they haven't been a significant share of the electorate. That's what I see really changing. It began in 2018. I'm confident that will continue to grow in 2020. I wanted to share with you just a handful of photographs focused around one of the policy areas that I shared with you, and that is gun control. What you see here is a group of people, all young people, volunteering for the group March for Our Lives, doing voter registration. This is unique because March for Our Lives is really started by students even younger than current college students. This is a group really started by high school students after the Parkland shooting in 2018. Emma Gonzalez, one of the leaders of that movement, was only 18 when she spoke in Washington, D.C. at their march. If an 18-year-old can do it, I know my college students can. And the young woman shown here, who looks to me to be maybe 14, I don't know, she's quite young, wearing the shirt What Emma Said. What we see here is that these young activists, like Emma Gonzalez, like Greta Thunberg, are motivating this younger population. And as she is arguing here at the rally that you see photographed, she's making this claim that children, of course, are worth more than what the NRA thinks they're worth, but she's doing it before she can even vote. This, to me, speaks very positively for her future voter turnout rate and that of all the other young people we see here. Same thing here. And at this one, you'll note that everybody in that photograph appears to be of high school age, potentially even younger. This is a group of students who, even if they can't vote yet, are motivated to create change. They're harnessing their institutional power to create that change. And they're being led by people not much older than themselves, and in many cases, even younger than many of you are. And again, just another example of that type of motivation, a group of very young people shown here in Washington. They're at a larger rally. There are certainly older people there. But what we're noticing among the multiple issues that I shared with you earlier, what we're noticing now is that greater motivation to action and to activism. That was really all I had wanted to share with you guys, just some information about current voting turnout rates and how those are changing and increasing dramatically. This, to me, is actually an incredibly optimistic moment. It's not often that you hear somebody older say they're hopeful and optimistic about a younger generation. It's usually the opposite that we hear. A lot of complaining, they don't do enough, they're not voting, they're not active. I really think this is changing, and I'd love to see that change even more.
Thank you so much, Dr. Strauss, for that.
Yeah.
And Dr. Strauss is a professor of political science at the College of St. Rose.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for your input on that.
Thank you.
Up next, and for our last topic of discussion, we have Patricia, who is the president of the League of Women Voters of Albany County. She'll be providing her expertise on voting, the pandemic impacts, and how you can make a difference. So I'll pass it off to you, Patricia.
Thank you guys so much for letting me present. Let me start with sharing my screen. Hold on a sec. I hope I'm doing the right thing here. Let's get it in this mode. Okay. Basically, I am very happy to be here today, and actually really did enjoy the last two presenters there, because so much of it crosses over with where we're coming from. So as you heard, I'm with the League of Women Voters, and really we're a national organization that was founded out of the suffragist movement. But what happened, and we're actually 100 years old. It's August 18th, 1921. I'm sorry, yeah, 1920, excuse me, that the 19th Amendment was passed, was ratified, giving the women the right to vote. But it's no secret, really, that that just meant white women. It wasn't until the 1965 Voting Rights Act when some of the barriers for people of color were removed. But the League really still feels, and always did back then, that there's still fights to fight, and we're all about democracy. So whether we're fighting voter suppression or expanded voter access, working to get money out of politics, gerrymandering, the list goes on and on. So if you look at our mission statement, you'll see the League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan political organization, and I'll stop there a minute. What it means by nonpartisan is that we really do not really carry a bias towards any party. We might, some of us may feel that way privately, but when we are speaking as a league, we are very, very cautious about really coming across as nonpartisan. It is so important because we want us to be taken seriously, and we are. We're actually looked at as an organization that can bring you level-headed, unbiased information. We worked really to increase the understanding of major public policy issue, and we influence that public policy through education and advocacy. So we're talking about policy issues that, you know, Dr. Strauss just talked about, a lot of youth are engaged with, which is natural resources, social welfare, good government reform, and so forth, gun control, gun safety. So we're doing work not just on voting, but we're also doing advocacy. I kind of tried to show that we have the national level, and then we have the state level, and then we have the local level. So the think globally, act locally is my take on really what we're doing. At the local level, and I've always felt this way, you can pretty much influence a whole lot more and get change than if you can at the federal or the state level. That's not to say that we don't really act on those other levels, but the ability really to work at the local level and see change is very important and is often overlooked. So for instance, I can say that I'm proud that, you know, the County of Albany for 3 decades was sued under the Voting Rights Act for how they gerrymandered. And our direct participation and influence in legislation in Albany County, with the voters approving it last election, actually helped us to change that process. And we are doing redistricting out of this 2020 census data in a much more transparent, diverse commission that is going to make a difference. So we do other things too locally that really you can influence so much more. All right, let me go to the next slide. So voting, what is, you know, it's at the top of the agenda here. you must vote. But I know, for instance, that my son came out of his high school participation in government class and basically said, Mom, it doesn't pay to vote. It's not going to make a difference. And I'm like, yes, Evan, you can. So really, when you think about the fact that every election is determined by the people who show up, and people have died for the right to vote. There's an old proverb that I like to think about when I think about voting and why you should vote, and it's, if you think you're too small to make a difference, well then try sleeping in a closed room with a mosquito. The smallest things can make a difference. And I've personally known elections that were literally won by less than 10 votes. When you vote locally, for instance, that's the stuff that's going to matter in your everyday life, whether it's the fact that you do or do not have parkland, how your roads are maintained, and if there's trash on the streets, how much your library has the materials you want. It's at that local level that voting even becomes, to me, just as important than it is at the state and federal levels. Unfortunately, most people think about voting only when it gets to a presidential election, but we, and myself particularly, I really feel that what they call down ballot, when you look at the ballot, they're in the order of importance or order of hierarchy. The down ballot elections are just as important, if not more so. I wanted to talk a little bit about the basics of voting. So right at the top, I put out the fact that what is the 10th Amendment? And the fact that it's anything that's not in the US Constitution is the ownership of the states. And for voting, that means that the states really rule, because our US Constitution doesn't have a whole lot in it on voting. There's some basics that exist across the states. You have to be a citizen, you have to be 18 years old, and every state has a registration process, every state has a ballot process. But with that as well, you can see that the league is more active on certain topics in certain states, because it's how they implement that can actually cause some issues with actually trying to exclude people from the process. So when you are thinking about voting, you yourself, you should always go first to look at what's your state doing. And that's why it is very important to understand, particularly if you're a college student, you actually get, in some cases, the choice of where you can vote. You can vote, you can say, my home is in Albany County, and I'm going to vote in New York, in Albany, or you can say, I live in Massachusetts, and I choose to vote in Massachusetts. So you need to understand your state and what their rights are before you actually take your actions. There are different methods in voting. So there's in-person voting, and that's largely what New York State has been about. There's absentee ballots, and that is also implemented in different ways. In New York, we have a no-excuse absentee ballot. And that means that, at this point at least, that means that you cannot use the absentee ballot if you just don't want to make it to the booth that day on a particular period. And you have to certify that you have a valid reason why you can't get to the polls. That is absolutely changing, what with the pandemic, but also with a lot of the changes that are going on in New York State. You have early voting, which is implemented in different ways in different states, and actually has a lot of change that happened in New York last year. And you also have vote by mail, a very different process that is in only a handful of states. When we start to look at New York, though, and I'm assuming most of us are, but it's representative potentially of other states. On the left, you'll see what is some of the basics. You have election cycles. So every year we vote on school board and their budgets. We vote on fire. We vote on library. A lot of people don't participate in those, and that's the sad part. But every 2 years, and they go back and forth between each other, you have local government elections. So for instance, last fall, there was a lot of voting on who are your mayors, who are your town supervisors, your city councils, and so forth, your clerks. And then there's also the state government, which is what we're in this year in 2020. But as Dr. Strauss pointed out, you also have the midterms, the federals that happen, which was last year. This year, it's the presidential, which is every 4 years. There's an election calendar that everyone should be aware of. This election calendar tells you when you need to register by, when you need to file an absentee ballot by. It also really dictates those people running for office a lot of the critical when you have to turn your petitions in by. This year, of course, the election calendar got all turned upside down with the pandemic, so everyone needs to be careful about what the current election calendar is. You can always find information like this on the Board of Elections website. We are also a closed primary state. That means that when you register, you can register with no party or you can register with a party. But if there's a primary in a particular party, then you can only be voting in that primary if in fact you were registered with that. So I always tell the story of my daughter who went off to college several years ago, and she wanted to vote in the last presidential primary. Unfortunately, she had originally registered as with no party. She thought she changed it. She did change it to vote, to associate with the Democratic Party. But what ended up happening is when she went to vote, she couldn't vote. She had missed the cutoff. And that's why the election calendar is so important. But as a closed primary state, only those people who are within that party can vote. Very different than some other states where it's an open primary. You also have a county level process that goes on in New York State. Basically, there's a board of elections at the state level, but every single county has their own process. They implement it, basically the rules and regulations to what they think is best for their county. So you can have pretty different levels of processing at one county versus another. And we've seen that pretty clearly. Even interacting with different boards of elections in different counties can be very different. It's interesting because we as a state, our board of elections are not independent. They are run by Republican and Democrat commissioners who are appointed to run them. And they could very well have separate processes. If you're a Republican versus if you're a Democrat, they can put in separate processes. So we have some nuance there that I find rather odd. On the right-hand side of the screen were what happened last year. So on the very first legislative day of January in 2019, there was a massive overhaul of voting reform that went in. For the legislature to pass so much in a single day, never mind the first day of the legislative session, was incredible. And it looked to really turn New York from being one of the worst, as what is represented, New York represented as a progressive state, we were pretty bad in how we implement our elections. So we ended up, and they strategically, it wanted to do it in 2019, so things could get sort of tested out and put in place for the presidential in 2020. Of course, now the pandemic throws a lot of that into a tailspin, but still we had wins. We implemented early voting. So if you voted downstate in the city or some of the other heavy metropolitan areas, you would find that you waited online a really long time to vote. And that turned people off. That's not good. Well, with early voting, you now can get out earlier and cast your ballot on 10 days before the election. We consolidated primaries. There used to be separate primary for the presidential and separate primary for the state and local. And putting those two together saved billions of dollars, but it also had people voting more. The more times you ask people to come out and vote, like putting your school board elections in May, the less likely that you're going to have people really turn out. So putting them together was a good thing. Uniform polling hours. I know a friend of mine who could not vote in a primary because she lived in Albany County and she needed to go to Boston in the morning to get there in the afternoon. And in Albany County, the polls weren't open until noon, where downstate they were open at 6 a.m. So now every county has uniform polling hours that start at 6 a.m. and they go to 9 p.m. Portable registration went in. So it used to be that if you moved in New York State from one county to another, you had to re-register. So now the registration should carry over automatically, so you don't not forced to go back and re-register. Most people weren't even aware they needed to re-register. Online registration took off, so you never could really register very well online before. The DMV has a process, but if you don't have a driver's license, you can do it through that. But if you don't have a driver's license, that's difficult. So they expanded the online registration process. Also, if you went out in certain counties last election cycle, you would see iPads where people were signing in to vote, as opposed to the old books where people were looking up your name and having you actually sign a book. So the electronic poll books actually made the whole process a lot more efficient. And that really had to go in some places for early voting, because they needed to know if you voted already. And putting out those books were never going to be up to date during the 10 days of the early voting period. Also, starting this January, pre-registration of 16 and 17-year-olds went into effect. This was largely due to the fact that that's the first time that a person is interacting with their government when they're usually going for their driver's license. Again, not necessarily in urban areas where there is public transportation, but it covers a lot of the population otherwise. So you could actually register while you were applying for your license, but at the same time, it changes us really doing registration in high schools and getting people engaged earlier. Voter-friendly ballots is something that's still working on. Our ballots are confusing. They really list the same candidate across multiple parties, multiple times. People get confused. They're also not the best in terms of being available, being readily readable by a handicapped and so forth. Valentine's Day party enrollment deadline. This was a big one. I told you before about my daughter changing her party enrollment. Well, that's because if you wanted to vote what used to be the September primary, you had to change your party enrollment the prior October. That's crazy. And so this moves it to Valentine's Day for actually being able to vote in the primary that is usually going to be held in April this year in June. There were also steps towards constitutional amendments. The New York State Constitution actually is one that is very strict in certain ways. So for instance, I talked to you before about absentee ballots, and really it being against the law to file an absentee ballot unless you have a valid reason why you can't get to the poll. So we want to change that, and that takes a constitutional amendment. Constitutional amendments take 2 legislative sessions to pass. So, and I realize I'm going way over here. So I'm going to go through real fast. And so there were changes there. We were part of the coalition for Let New York Vote. I'm going to be real quick here. So change. What happened with coronavirus? And I want everyone to recognize that you can text Vote New York to 474747 and you'll get updates. We postponed the April primaries to go to June. But then as soon as we did that, there was also an executive mandate to expand absentee ballots. So you didn't have to have that excuse. You could say that your health concern was a valid excuse. And then there was the absentee ballot request by mail. So in other words, I don't have to actually reach out. They'll send it to me to say, do I want an absentee ballot? And then there was also the cancellation of the Democratic primary. There are risks, major risks associated with this election, significant risks. Lower turnout because of health concerns, there's going to be a surge in absentee ballots. We usually have about 4% of the population voting in absentee ballots. And that surge, the Board of Elections, that's a very manual process for them. They are very concerned about how the hell are they going to count all those and get them done. And so if there is that surge, we might not get the results that we want on a timely basis. And there's also some potential for error there. We're going to have a lot less election inspectors. They're usually older people who have concerns. That's where one of the things that you can do is become an election inspector and get paid for that. And what a way to see our democratic process. So election funding is a critical issue right now. There's just not, for all the changes going on, we don't think that we have enough funding for the process. We didn't have enough funding just because of all the reform we did, but there's more even now with the changes. So I'm going to just want to make sure that everyone knows when you do go to vote, you should be educated. So the League of Women Voters has vote411.org. It tells you a lot about who you can vote for, what the proposition means. It gives you sample ballots. We do all that work locally. The Board of Elections is a great resource for even knowing who represents you. Project Vote Smart really tells you a lot about where candidates stand on issues and who's funding their campaigns. So you want to know about that. And there's always Rock the Vote. So the last slide very quickly is get involved. Did you fill out your census yet? That makes a huge difference. But you can even just talk to others, become an election inspector. The League has many volunteer positions. We do naturalization ceremonies. If you've ever been to one of those and you volunteered, they're amazing experiences. We do high school registration, tabling. We do candidate forums, and we're always looking for volunteers to help, to be timekeepers and question coordinators. We're very heavy into Observer Corps. Just knowing that somebody is watching your representatives, they act differently. And plus, when you go, you find out what's really going on. What things are they working on? Stuff you never knew about. And really, you can advocate. You can contact your representatives. You can use social media as leverage, and you can write letters to the editor. So sorry for rushing through. I apologize for going over, but that's what I have. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Patricia. That was absolutely amazing, especially the stuff you had there at the end about the different websites and organizations that could help voters. That was absolutely fantastic.
We want everyone to be educated.
Absolutely. Now that our panelists are all finished, if anybody has any additional questions for Patricia or the other presenters, please feel free to put them in the comments section and be sure to direct them at the specific presenter. I did ask Patricia a question that was answered by the League of Women Voters, which was if you would like to join the League of Women Voters, you can see it in the comments section. You can contact Patricia or use the email in the chat box. For those of you watching and that cannot read the chat box, that is rmt370@gmail.com.
Or you could go to our website too. And just a quick note too, we have a policy with membership as, pay what you can. So we want more involvement. The League has actually been mostly older women who came out of that 60s generation of I want change. And we're attracting more of the younger generation, which is exactly what's needed.
All right, Victoria?
Yeah, it looks like we do have a question for you, Patricia, from the chat box from Josh. He's wondering what made you passionate about being a part of the League of Women Voters?
Oh, that's a good question. Part of it is that my parents were always engaged in what was going on. They went to, town board meetings. They, always took me to vote and so forth. And then later, my mother actually was, actually ran for town supervisor where she lived. And I just always saw that you can make a difference. And the more I got involved in the League, the more I wanted to do more because I could see that I could actually make a change. And that's where, again, just my take on it, think globally, act locally, you can do stuff at the local level. You can actually get change, and it becomes infectious when you can do that.
That's great. Thank you. Let's see. So I guess we're going to finish up the session here now. I'd like to thank our panelists today for taking the time out of your busy schedule. I understand that for everyone right now, our lives have kind of been turned upside down. And so I really appreciate you taking the time to make this a priority. I feel like, especially now because of the pandemic, people are missing that opportunity to connect with other people. And I think that this has been a really great way for us to connect over something that's important in our community, in our lives, in our world. So I really appreciate you guys taking the time to do that. I'd also like to thank the participants and the viewers who took their time to increase their knowledge and understanding of democracy and how they can become more involved. Kyle, you want to take it from here?
Sure. For additional resources, please feel free to scan that QR code. We did have several resources we were going to distribute at our original event, which was planned for last month. But given the changes, we can no longer distribute those. So to compensate, we've uploaded them online. There's some quick links to check to see if you're registered to vote, find out where your polling places are. There is also a brochure listing different organizations in Albany to become politically involved. So feel free to check that out. And don't forget to check out the Office of Spiritual Life on Facebook, our sponsors for the event. Contact information for all of our experts on the panel today are in this slide. We would also like to share for attending our event, all participants have a chance to win a raffle for a social justice kit consisting of a St. Rose aluminum water bottle, reusable metal straws, eco-friendly bags, and a Save Our World sticker, as well as 2 activist books, How I Resist, Activism and Hope for a New Generation by Maureen Johnson, and Roadmap for Revolutionaries, Resistance, Activism, and Advocacy for All by Elisa Kimhort-Page, Carolyn Durin, and Jamia Wilson. Please use that email below and use the subject line raffle entry so that you can be entered to win by the time you leave this presentation. With all that said, thank you to our attendees for joining our webinar. Again, if you missed any segments or you joined us a little late, a recorded version of this webinar will be available on the Office of Spiritual Life Facebook page. And again, thank you to our attendees, and especially thank you to our expert panelists for joining us on short notice and having such valuable information to share with our audience. It is greatly appreciated, not only from myself, but from the other organizers as well that cannot be here today.
And thank you to Victoria and Kyle for pulling this together. This is exactly why I have so much more hope right now.
Thank you as well. I echo that. Very good.
Excellent.
You.
Thank you, guys.
Have a good day.
You too.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.